we're going to quickly talk about Venture's process and how we're actually going to go about our interview process. We'll do a case interview overview, so what exactly you should expect from a case interview. We'll be doing a guided case practice, which Leo and I will go through step by step and show you some of what to expect from case interviews. Then we'll talk about some of the best practices that we've learned and actually sort of synthesize all of what we're telling you. Then you'll actually have a chance to apply those skills in breakout rooms, and then we'll come back together at the end. So with that, let's quickly talk through our application process. Well, actually, you kind of know the application process. The application is due tomorrow at noon, and then we'll be having group interviews on Saturday, individual interviews, which is including a case and behavioral portion on Sunday, and then social night next Tuesday. But with that, I will pass it off to Leo to do a case interview overview.
Thanks, Samir. Hopefully my voice is okay. I just screamed like for 10 minutes straight after my Toronto Raptors hit a game winner. About an hour
Toronto Raptors.
Our Toronto Raptors. Yes, Parham. So hopefully my voice holds up. So in order to, all right, I have control. So in order to talk about the case interview, let's start with consulting. Defining consulting simply is helping businesses solve their most pressing problems. And listed on the right are a handful of business problems we tend to see that everyday management might face some of these. Profitability, how can we make more money? New product introduction, what is the best way for us to introduce a product onto market? M&A, who are we trying to acquire? Why are we trying to acquire the company? What do we do after an acquisition? Questions like these plague management, day in, day out, and these are the types of questions consulting tries to answer. So a case interview is an interview format in which the candidate is presented with a case or a business problem. The case interview is designed to simulate a consultant's experience when they're actually working on the project. And so this is kind of like a simulation of what you'll experience as a consultant in Venture. And so case interviews generally can contain these 6 aspects. There's a problem approach, there's market sizing, there's a graphical analysis, qualitative analysis, quantitative analysis, and of course, wrapping up the case. So we'll go through each of these steps one by one and show you the steps in which you should approach each of these segments and what we are looking for as well. Speaking of what we're looking for, here are some of the case interview essentials, we call it, but more so, these are what would make a strong case. So one is structured analysis. Are you able to work through a business case in a structured manner? That's one of the most important things. Second is communication. Can we follow along with your thought process, and can you take us along your journey solving this business problem? Professionalism, creativity, teachability, good attitude are a number of the other things that come into play as well. And we will provide you with a list of best practices after we go through our guided practice that will help you hit all of these points. So stay tuned for that as well. With that, we shall dive straight into the guided practice. So we'll jump through the 6 types of questions you'll see, and we'll pause and there'll be some interactive parts where we will need your participation in the chat as well as we go through. So without further ado, let us begin with the intro. So we'll walk through an example case as we go along. The case here says this, right? Your client is a high-end organic food store that is facing declining profits. The CEO has reached out to us to figure out why and what they should do about it. How would you approach this problem? So the interviewer will present you with this, and there are now 4 things you should do. 1 is to confirm the details. Who is your client? Who are you working for? What is the business what is their business? In this case, it's, Samir, can we go up 2 slides, please?
What's going on? This is really, okay, there we go.
Okay.
Here?
1 more.
All right, my mistake, sorry about that.
All good. So the detail here is that your client is a high-end organic food store. This is an important piece of detail because it's who you're working for. Next is to confirm the goals. So what does the client have trouble with? What do they want you to help solve? In this case, there are 2 things, right? 2 parts to this case where 2 parts to this. 1 is facing declining profits. That's kind of the big part. And second is, okay, Now that you know they have declining profits, what should they do about it? So at this point, you might want to repeat back to your interviewer the important details: who you're working for, high-end organic food store, and what their goals are. They're facing declining profits, and we're here to help figure out strategies to help mitigate that and improve profitability. Now, at this point, you would move on to step number 3, which is to ask clarifying questions. So the purpose of asking questions here is so you have enough basic information to move forward with the case. There are 2 main categories of questions you want to ask here. One is if there are any strategic objectives or numerical goals that the client has in mind. So that's the first one listed on the right. And the second is general questions about like making sure you understand the business, right? Sometimes, we think high-end organic food store, that's probably pretty, across we probably all have a kind of a good idea of how they operate. But if we give you a industry that is, let's say, car wash chemical, which we had one of those in the past, there's not many of us that are going to understand what the ins and outs of this industry, and the ins and outs of the business model. So here's where you need to ask questions and say, okay, who's the supplier in this business? Who's selling things? Like who's buying this from this company? Like what's the manufacturing process like? So that you have a general understanding of what the business is like. So these are the kinds of questions you definitely want to ask. Otherwise, if you have a gist of anything else that you think might be relevant, the last 2 questions on the right-hand side here will help answer those as well. But you don't need to spend too much time asking too many questions. It's just so that you have a good basis of what you need to know. So here, the interviewer might respond to you the following: the client is a high-end organic food store, declining profits. There's no specific numerical goal. The goal is just to figure out why profits are declining and ideate ways to solve it. And now is a good time to ask for some time. And you need to ask for some time because step number 4 is kind of the big part in this first question, is to set up your approach to the problem. So in consulting, the question you get from your client is really big sometimes, right? Improve profitability. Geez, everyone wants to do that. But that's a big problem. Now what you want to do is break that problem down into smaller parts that are more manageable. You want to break the problem down to manageable parts such that when you solve each of the smaller parts, you solve the bigger problem at hand. And the best way to do this is through a framework. So you've probably heard of the term McKinsey if you've been searching case guides, case workshop things on the internet. McKinsey just means mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. Each piece is independent of a framework. So you can also imagine a tree, right? A root at the very top, and then it has branches coming down. And if you solve each of the different branches who are all separate from each other, but added together, they make up the whole, then you're able to solve the bigger problem at hand. So common frameworks that can help you crack some of these business problems include profits equals revenue minus costs, internal and external factors, product, place, price, and promotion. These are all just buckets of ideas. At the end of the day, they're just buckets, right? That's a way for you to organize your ideas so that you can solve the problem. There's no need to memorize these frameworks. And the key here is actually to be creative and be flexible and be very specific to the case that you have. Because if you can apply this framework elsewhere, then it might not be specific enough for this case at hand. So knowing this, I want you to just think about the problem we had beforehand. I know I've been speaking for a little bit. And I want you to just answer in the chat, which of these frameworks which of these frameworks would you incorporate in your approach to this problem? And if you could give like a sentence as to why, that would be great. So I'll give you guys like 30 seconds, a minute or so, think about it and type it out in the chat.
Leo, maybe state the answer one more time. Oh, there we go.
Wait, Parham, what do you mean by the answer?
Sorry, I meant to state the question one more time, but it looks like a lot of people are responding, so.
Got it, okay. Seeing a lot of profits equals revenues minus costs. It's the most basic understanding that we need. Figure out if revenues are too high, revenues are too low, costs are too high. 4 P's to understand declining profitability, right? Figure out where the problem is coming from. That's a good one. Profitability problem solve, probably use revenues and costs. Yeah. Profits and external factors. I like that one because you're blending in all the different factors that can be involved, right? Profits is just the finances if you think about it. And so there's also ways you can kind of maneuver around that. And I scroll up even more and it's we the north. So, okay, good. Liking some of these answers here. Again, there's no right answer either. As long as your framework is MECE and you're able to explain it in a clear manner, then it's a good framework and and that'll be good for this question. So here's how we might think about it. A lot of you mentioned the profits equals revenue minus costs. We can break down revenue into smaller pieces, price times quantity, and cost is both fixed plus variable costs. So if you were to provide us with this framework, it would be, it'd be okay. But you can apply this framework to a lot of different business problems. And that means this framework is probably not going to help you actually get to a good answer for your case. So what you want to really think about is, I need to be specific to the case at hand. And in this case is that, it's a high-end organic food store. It's in the food grocery industry and it's facing declining profits. So you want to be more specific within each of these buckets. So if we fill out some of these buckets, this is what a good framework might look like. Underneath price, we know that things that can influence price are competitors. What are competitors pricing their products at? And company branding. How willing are people to pay a premium in order to come to our store and purchase from us? We know that quantity also is changed by taste preferences and distribution. So if there are distribution channels that allows us to sell more or buy more from our suppliers, maybe that impacts our quantity. And then on the cost side, we might say in variable costs is made up of labor. It's made up of maybe suboptimal storage, and maybe farming costs have increased as well. So the key here is to be specific. And that's how you will be able to deliver a good response to question 1. I'm gonna pause there and see if there are any questions in the chat on question 1. There's a question, is there a reason it should be MECE? Yes, the reason is that you want to break a problem down into its smaller pieces so they're more manageable, right? Instead of answering, how do we improve profitability? Now it's, how can we improve price? And how do we improve price? Can we charge more? How do we answer that question? We need to look at our competitors. What are they charging? What do our customers see about us? How strong is our brand? And if the answers to those questions are, the brand is good enough where we can charge more and the competitors are very highly priced and we're lower than them and we have space to improve our price, then that can help you answer the question and that will improve profitability. So the idea is that you want to cover your bases and you want to be able to solve the bigger problem in smaller chunks. But once you solve all the smaller chunks, you fit everything together.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Give examples of, would competitors fall under both quantity and price? Yeah, it can. It definitely can. And it's up to you how you want to explain it, right? What about competitors are you most curious about? I guess for us here, it was competitors and price. There's a big, we want to figure out what competitors are pricing at. Could you give examples of internal factors? So this framework is more, blending in the internal and external within the profits, but internal factors we can chat about here. And we can see here that our labor costs, suboptimal storage is a internal thing, right? It's your own supply chains. Real estate rent increase, that's more external. Overinvestment of equipment, that's an internal thing. So when you think internal, I think the good way to think about it is, what are the different business units, right? There's sales and marketing. There's human resources, that's more labor oriented. There's research development. There's et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Okay, if there are any more questions, I'll go ahead and answer in the chat. Otherwise, I'll pass it back to Samira, who will take us through question 2.
Awesome, thank you, Leo. So the next piece is one that many of you are probably somewhat familiar with, which is market sizing. And what market sizing really is it's a problem that you probably don't know the answer to off the top of your head, like the Berkeley Chipotle or how many red Solo cups are used by Berkeley students. In fact, honestly, for some of these market sizing questions, if you do know the exact answer, you should probably be like alarmed. Like if you know how many licks it takes to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop, like don't be doing consulting. Like go become like the head of Tootsie Pops, right? Like the whole idea of market sizing is how you can take a really complex problem and use your logical reasoning to break it down. So let's go through an example in this. So after looking at your approach, your client wants to know what is the average weekly revenue generated at a food store in the US. So whenever you get a problem like this, like first off, pretty much no one knows what the average weekly revenue, at a food store is. The first thing you want to do is ask clarifying questions because obviously there's a lot of ambiguity with this question. So here are a couple of good examples of clarifying questions. For example, you want to confirm the goal. The first question here where you see my cursor is just confirming that you know what the answer is and what the question is, right? We're going to be giving these questions to you orally. So it's really, really important for you to actually listen to what we're saying and restate it. The second question, really, really important. What does it mean when we say a food store? A food store can be a lot of different things. It could be, a grocery store. It could be a restaurant in some cases. It could be a supermarket. And so knowing kind of what a food store entails can really help you to scope your problem effectively. And in general, right, sometimes with market sizing questions, they are intentionally ambiguous. So it's really important for you to actually clarify that. It's not a stupid question to ask what a food store is. And then the third question is my approach to this problem clear to you? One of the themes you'll see throughout this case workshop is it's really, really important to communicate with your interviewers. And with market sizing, where it's logical reasoning, a lot of times, we're here to help you out. We're here to kind of go through it with you. And so whenever you sort of confirm your approach with us, that's really helpful. Next is to create buckets. So Leo mentioned using McKinsey approaches to break down frameworks and take to build a framework for a larger problem. Market sizing is really the same way. You want to take this and you want to break it down a little bit. So moving forward, here's an example of what buckets we might use for this. We're going to say convenience stores, grocery stores, and supermarkets are our three types of food store in this country. And again, these are different, there are lots of different ways to do buckets. And so a good question to ask would basically be, hey, these are my three buckets right now. Does everything look good to you? And I'm going to say, yeah, these are the three things we care about. We want to look at convenience stores, grocery stores, and supermarkets whenever we're gauging revenue generated by food stores. And one thing I might add is, convenience stores, grocery stores, supermarkets, people are going to, behave a little bit differently. Whenever you go to Walgreens versus going to Safeway, you're going to buy something different, right? So, and this is a case where you can kind of bring your anecdotal, experience to this. So I'm going to also turn this towards all of you for a second and think about how might you approach this problem, right? You have this really ambiguous prompt, but how can you break it down and bucket it? So take a minute to think and drop your suggestions in the chat. I'm excited to see what we have in here. Yeah, and just to clarify, think about how you would break down this problem for different types of food store. No wrong answers also.
Guys, we know it's the second week, but we really need you guys to tone down the enthusiasm here. All right, there we go.
Oh, yeah, demographic. That's a great idea. Suburban, metropolitan, very good idea. I like that. Urban, rural, yep, good. Yeah, fast food is an interesting one because, again, depending on how we define food store could be different. Seasons is really interesting as well. People might buy different things in different seasons, different states. Yep, organic versus supermarkets. Yeah, so that way you're stratifying based on the types of things you're going to buy. Online food stores, very important during COVID. Income demographics, age group. Age group is interesting. Chains and local stores, geography, price point, bougie versus cheap. Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, so these are some really great thinking, pieces of thinking that all of you are coming up with. And yeah, like it's not obvious, like always obvious what, the answer is, but these are all really great approaches and very logical, right? The key is, again, make sure that your buckets are meaty and make sure that, you're thinking about a lot of different factors. And again, like lean on your personal, experience with this. Obviously, there are sometimes the case where you'll have a car wash chemical where you probably don't have much experience, but in the case of grocery stores, absolutely lean on your experience. So the next piece here from that, thank you for all of your suggestions, is to create those buckets. So as I mentioned in this past slide, you see where my cursor is, where we want to modify this approach to be a little bit more robust and talk about consumer behavior across these buckets. So let's talk about average purchase size, because for example, when you go to Walgreens, a convenience store versus Safeway, a supermarket, you're going to spend, a different amount at each place. So absolutely makes sense here. The other thing too to think about here is average. Average is really, really important because we're thinking about the average town in the US, like Averageville. How much do people actually spend in the average town here? So first thing is we're gonna just make some assumptions here. Like the biggest thing with market sizing is you wanna make reasonable assumptions that you can logically defend. So we're gonna say that in the average town in the United States, there are 6 convenience stores, 3 grocery stores, and 1 supermarket. And those 6 convenience stores get 1,000 customers each, 3 grocery stores get 1,000 customers each, and supermarkets gets 2,000 customers in a given week. And again, like this is something where you're not always gonna know the answer. In fact, again, like if you know exactly the ratio of this, like that's like some next level thinking right there. The key is, can you break this down and defend those reasonably? And this is a perfectly reasonable way to break down this problem. Next, as you mentioned, there's average purchase size. So at a convenience store, you might spend $10, grocery store 20, supermarket 40. Again, make sure that these numbers make sense in the context of what you're doing. So filling in the numbers is really about making assumptions. Then the next piece is calculating the numbers. And this is really just some simple multiplication, right? You're gonna multiply that 6 stores by 1,000 customers by $10, get $60,000 generated by convenience stores in the average town in the US. You repeat that for groceries and supermarkets, and you're going to get a total of $200,000 generated per week by 10 stores. And of course, remember what the overall answer was, which was the average weekly revenue. You divide by 10. So in general, right, this is just about using assumptions and using your own logic and intuition to try and break down a complex problem. But what makes so this is like, I'm going to call this like a B+ answer because you've done kind of everything you're expected to do. But what makes the B+ answer into an A+ answer is this step 5 here, which is to assess and contextualize. So what's always important in consulting is thinking about, we make assumptions all the time in consulting, but the key is to think about what those limitations of those things might be. So one assessment we might have is that we overestimated the convenience store average purchase. So for example, like a Pepsi Cola does not cost, $10 at a convenience store. It'll cost like $2. And so if, for example, the majority of convenience store customers only buy Pepsi, then, it's not going to be $10. Same thing with supermarket weekly visitors. Maybe in a town of 5,000 people, like 3,000 people go to the supermarket every week, right? In general, just thinking about where the limitations in your assumptions might be is really important because those will sort of guide your inquiry going forward. Next is to contextualize. How is this relevant to the case? This is really, really important because again, like a case is not isolated. It's not discrete pieces. Everything is kind of a storyline and all the information sort of feeds together. So let's think about ways that this $20,000 figure could be useful. One is benchmarking clients' revenue. This is super important because again, we mentioned competitors are really important in our framework. And so if $20,000 for an average weekly revenue for an average supermarket for our client is their revenue, and we look at their competitors and it's exactly the same, then this profitability issue is probably on the cost side. But if we look at, let's say, revenue over the past 5 years and we see that it's gone down, then perhaps the issue is on the revenue side. So as you can see here, the way that you do market sizing can make a big difference in the efficiency with which you process your framework. So yeah, I think like that's like a big piece of this. So I see a couple of questions in the chat here. First, Hanson's question, if you were to find large differences between buckets, would it be appropriate to give more than one answer? Or does that just mean that there's a better way to split buckets? Whenever you say large differences, do you mean like that, you know, like supermarkets is like 10 times the size of like convenience stores? Or is it that, you know, there's a lot of disparity between, you know, what, like sort of like a large range between answers? Let's say grocery stores make much more profits than other stores, so a large range. Huh, that's actually really interesting. So in this case, that's a really interesting point. But remember, in this case, we're looking at revenue, right? So what I would say is that, you know, revenue for this problem in particular is like the way that I would do it. But I think in the case of like profits, if we want to market size that, I think that you should just stick to one approach and try and defend it. Again, remember, market sizing, especially, you know, in like an actual consulting case, is going to be a lot more thorough and a lot more in-depth, and you'll actually have time to explore that. In a case interview, like be willing to keep it a little bit simpler. So I hope that answers your question. Nilay's question, how do we choose whether we want to underestimate or overestimate metrics? That's a good question as well. I don't think it's necessarily a conscious choice. I think it's just an assumption that you make whenever you actually are choosing numbers. But I think it's just good to be cognizant that it might be an underestimate or an overestimate. And sometimes, again, in a normal like case where you're really doing market sizing and you have like hours and hours to think about it, you might actually end up putting a range on it. So I would just say, for the sake of a case interview, keep it simple. Pick like one or two things that you want to talk about and just like roll with that. So I hope that answers your question. And if there are any other questions, happy to answer them in the chat as well. So with that, I will pass it back off to Leo.
Thanks, Samir. So the next question is graphical analysis. The client's internal team, so this is what the interviewer might say to you. The client's internal team has conducted extensive financial analysis and discovered that their revenues are quite competitive in this space, but it appears that their costs are significantly greater than their competition. What are some insights you can make out of this graph, and which cost bucket would you focus on reducing, and how? So when you're provided with a graph, here are the 4 things you need to think about. Step 1 is to recall your goal. What was your goal? The goal is kind of the case question you're trying to answer at the very beginning. It was the profitability one. So 1, I want to make some insights about which cost to reduce. Step number 2 is to state what the graph represents. This may sound a little dumb, but literally we suggest you read out what's on the y-axis, what's on the x-axis, what are each of the different segments and the different colors and different labels you see on the graph, because this helps you clear your thinking and make sure you know what is going on. It's very easy to skip forward as you're reading a graph, and maybe you miss that it's talking about revenues per year instead of revenues per 3 years. And these little details do make or break your insights. So it's really important to make sure you know what's on the axes, and it's all okay for you to say that out loud and walk it through with us as you're reading and understanding the graph. Also, it buys you more time to find the insights. Step number 3 is to identify and explain the most important trends. So what is the thing that sticks out the most about the graph? You should probably point those out. So we see that the warehouse graph here, or the warehouse cost, is consistently the highest across the last 4 years. We also see that costs for labor have increased from 10,000 to 35,000 in nearly 3 years. That is an incredibly fast rate at which labor costs have grown. And then, since we have time and this graph is not overly complicated, we can also say that advertising costs don't have much of a trend. It starts out at 30,000, drops down to 20,000, but it comes back to 30,000. So once you've done this, you've probably, again, this is like a B+ answer, but we need to know why this graph matters. We're giving it to you for a reason. So you have to assess and connect it back to the overall answer and provide a takeaway. So here we clearly know that warehousing costs and labor costs are 2 of the biggest issues here. So potentially you can suggest ways that, you could either suggest ways we can mitigate those costs, or you can suggest that we should look into warehouse costs even more by breaking it down even further. But I think providing suggestions here would be a good way to continue. So example suggestions are that warehouse costs can be reduced by creating long-term partnership with warehouse owners and determining goals for in-house brand to reduce third-party storage. So maybe instead of relying on a third party, do it ourselves. And then for labor costs, we could potentially reduce training programs, self-checkout counters, and production improvements for in-house brand. Cool. I'm just gonna skim through the chat and see if there are any questions that have been unanswered. Parham, thanks for answering the question. For market sizing, are most questions usually business related, or can we get questions like the Tootsie Pops question too? Well, the market sizing question will always, they will be very much related to the case. It'll be in the same industry, it has something to do with the case, that's for sure, because you need to understand the context, right, using market sizing. But it may not be may not be a dollar figure. Sometimes it might be a quantity as well. Cool. Awesome. I will pass it back to Samir for the next question. If you have questions about graphs, please pop them in the chat and we'll answer them in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you, Leo. So now is probably the most fun question of most cases. Every case contains what we call a creative business question. And this is really where you get to bring your creativity and your unique experience to the table. I know a lot of you have been talking about Costco in the chat, and I think that especially for this one, you will love thinking about Costco. So here's our creative business question for this case. In order to improve revenue streams, analysts indicate our in-house brand should have a bigger presence in our stores. What are some marketing strategies that would help improve the sales of their in-house brand? So basically, like if you think about it, like how can Costco sell more of Kirkland? That would be like a good like proxy to think about for this. So there are two good ways to approach this problem. They're equally good, in my opinion. I personally use the left-hand side approach. I know Leo usually uses the right-hand side approach. They're equal, and it's really about how you think. But at its core, it's really about thinking about how you can brainstorm a lot of different approaches to this problem and then organize them in such a way that you can actually present them effectively. As you'll see, like the step 3 is the same for both of them. Succinctly talk about each bucket. And really the idea is to have buckets and brainstorm ideas. So with that, let's actually look at, normally we would do a live brainstorm, but it's going to be challenging to do that on Zoom. But we'll do the right-hand side approach and we'll be utilizing the chat to get your ideas. So let's actually look at these two MECE buckets that we've come up with. External ads and in-store promotions. Those are like the two big things we're looking at. And obviously there are lots of different strategies that can go into either side of this. So let's move and actually think about, in the chat, what are some examples of strategies for each bucket? So let's start with external ads first. Don't think about in-store promotions. What are some marketing strategies that will help improve the sales of an in-house brand through external ads? Coupons and rebates, yeah, that would be good. Pay-per-click, yeah, pay-per-click could work for certain things. Micro-influencers, really good one. Public figure endorsement, good. Advertisements, ads, programs, discounts, yep, social media, good. Location billboards, that's a really good one. Sponsoring creators, special membership, yep, good. Yeah, these are great ideas. These are all amazing ideas. I think these are really, really good. So let's flip the switch a little bit and let's look at in-store promotions. So think about what are some marketing strategies inside of the store that could actually really help with this. Free samples, amazing. Signs, good. Put the product at the front, very, very good. Yep, discounts as well. High traffic areas, good. Discounting in-store aesthetic, yep, good ones. Sign-ups for newsletters, Kirkland products at eye level. Ooh, eye level is a really interesting idea. Combine it with a product that's bought very often, very clever. Product of the week, love that one. Yeah, these are some amazing ideas. Again, like right here, all of you came up with this stuff right off the top of your head. And so really the key, put it by the chicken bake, that stuff slaps. Totally agree with that one. So yes, in general, there are lots of really fun ways that, and you can be really creative with this. So for example, like I know that whenever I first saw this example, like whenever Leo and I were like refurbishing this case, the first thing I thought of for improving the sales of an in-house brand was like an Hermes window. Like Hermes is really famous for their really like eye-catching window displays. And so like, I know for a fact, like I don't have the money to buy Hermes stuff, but I was really intrigued to like try and buy it because of those window displays. And for an in-store promotion, making something eye-catching, right? There are lots of different ways that you can be fun with this and really like thoroughly, like this is like a question that's supposed to be enjoyable. So definitely try to do that. So yeah, here are just a couple of examples, right? We have health tweets. I know someone mentioned influencers. We talked about TV spots, in-store. We talked about samples. We talked about in-house products at the front. We talked about product displays, right? Everything, we talked about that. So cool. Now the next piece of this is to talk about each bucket succinctly. And I'll just like basically present this like how you might present it in an interview. So I'll basically go up and say, all right, you know, thank you. I made my framework. I came up with all of my amazing ideas, and now I'm going to present this to you. So there are two key families of solutions and strategies that the client can use to improve their sales of the in-house brand. There are external ads and there are in-store promotions. 3 examples of external ads would be using social media like Twitter to produce health tweets, to place TV spots advertising this in-house brand, and to use Instagram influencers to champion the brand forward. On the in-store side, 3 really cool strategies could be to use free samples, like what we see at Costco, putting in-house products at the front, or using eye-catching in-house product displays like Hermes. And these are all really great ways to get, you know, marketing strategies to improve sales. So again, like the key here, and like again, another theme that you're noticing through this is be creative and organize your thoughts, and take a minute to do that. And if you do that, you'll notice that this is really, really like just kind of reading it off, and it sounds very polished. So with that, let's pass it off to Leo to talk about our quantitative question. And yeah, awesome. Yeah, these are great questions and good answers as well.
Big shout out to Parham and the rest of the exec helping answer questions in the chat. Awesome. Quantitative question. This is number 5. We are almost at the end, and then we'll let you go into your into some small group practice, so you get a chance to apply all of this. Question 5. So this is the quantitative question, and traditionally, what this sometimes might be a little scary for applicants is that is stumbling on this, because this is one of those where you're like, oh, I might make a mistake here or there when I'm doing the math. Don't worry, that's the fill in and calculate, the calculations. That's not the most important part of this. The more important part is how can you turn the problem at hand into an equation, into an approach, and then also the assessment and contextualizing your answer at the very end. So stumbling on math and getting some numbers slightly crossed up, and that's all okay. We're not looking for human calculators. And we'll mention this in a bit, but that's just kind of like a upfront. But here we have a question from our interviewer. Out of the above ideas you presented, the client is most interested in pursuing an Instagram influencer strategy to improve sales. How many influencers does your client need to contract in order to generate 100K in revenue? Assume the cost of acquiring each influencer is 20K. So step number 1 is to clarify the goal. You might repeat back and ask, just to clarify, I need to figure out how many influencers will generate 100K in sales. Another good question here would be asking, are there any cost goals we have to be mindful of? And the interviewer may reply, yes. And for the second one, not at the moment. So you might go ahead. The next step is to break the problem down. This is where the bulk of this is probably like the important part of this question is, okay, you need to turn the words into a math problem. So here is how we might want to approach this problem. In order to get to the number of influencers, we might want to know how much investing in each influencer increases our revenue. So if we can get a sense of how much each influencer increases our revenue, then we can get the number of Instagram influencers. In order to get the revenue number, we might start with how many followers an influencer has, what the conversion rate is, so how many of those followers will actually become customers in the store. And among those customers, how much might they spend on average? So you'll present this as like an approach to the problem. Here's how I'm thinking about it, like an equation almost. And then at this point, you might ask, this is how I'm breaking the problem down. Does everything make sense to you? It's really important to keep the interviewer in the loop when you're doing these math problems, especially because you want to make sure the interviewer is following along with your approach and that it makes sense. So usually with quantitative problems, at this point, you will probably they will say, yeah, that does make sense. And they probably have some information for you. So now you might ask, okay, what's the average number of followers per influencer? What's the conversion rate? What's the average spending per customer? And the interviewer will provide that to you. So now with that, you can go ahead, plug it in and do the math, right? 250,000 followers, it's a 0.5% conversion. So that'll come out to $12.50. Average spending is $20, that's given. And you'll come out to an answer of 25K of revenue generated per influencer. And you know you want 100K, that's your goal. So you divide 100K by 25K and you get 4. So the key here is up till this point is for you to really be clear about your approach to the problem, and it helped for you to write it down on paper and kind of show it to the interviewer. And that's really, really important, is being communicative throughout this entire quantitative process. But this is a B+ answer, right? The important part is contextualizing what the number 4 means. So now you want to ask yourself, okay, how is this relevant to the case? On the screen here are 2 potential reasons we can take, or 2 potential next steps we can take now that we know this number. One is we can calculate how much the strategy would cost and see if revenues indeed are more than costs, so that we're actually increasing profit. Number 2 is we might figure out if this 100K revenue number is significant enough, right? If the client's current annual revenue is 100 million, 100K is not going to do anything. It's 1%, 0.1% of 100 million. How is that? That's then the strategy shouldn't even be considered because it's such a small impact. So, quick question here for all of you to interact in the chat is, which of these points, which of these 2 is more relevant to the case? Or if you have an idea for like a conclusion or like a takeaway for this number, you can also put it in the chat as well. I'll give you guys 30 seconds to do so. So there's a question in the chat. Hanson's asks, for something like the conversion rate, is it your job to find that number, or are you simply suggesting the employer should try to find that number and act upon it? So we will, it depends on the case. Usually for something like that, they might say like, hey, well, we have the number for you. If not, then they might say, you can just give it an estimate. And in those cases, right, it's not like we're okay with estimates and guesstimates. In consulting, you don't have enough time to get to like an exact answer all the time. You just want an answer that's good enough, like close enough. So there's no need to worry about specifically, oh, how do you come up with a conversion rate? We'll either give it to you or tell you to assume like a random number or a number that's like makes sense. Suggest number 1, that's the main goal of the case. Both are relevant, but first one is more relevant because profits are lower than competition. Companies looking to increase profits, first point is more relevant. That's good. 2, because revenues drop in the bucket compared to companies' average revenue. Even if you make small profit, it might not be worth it to implement. Essentially, do first, two first, and then consider 1. Yeah, the correct answer to this chat interactive question is, both are good. The first one is more relevant to the case at hand, but the second one shows that you're aware that it's, you can get a ballpark estimate in like a minute of whether or not 100K is good, then that's good, right? Whereas the first strategy, you might have to take more time. So both of these answers would be good, but the first one does relate back more to the case, and that's really important as well. Okay, I'll pass it off to Samir for the conclusion. Samir, take it away.
Yep, awesome, thank you. So at the end of your case, the last thing that we like to do is wrap it up with a 1-minute presentation. And this is one of the few things where like, it's a pretty strict formula and you should do your best to follow it just because it'll make everyone's life easier. One of the biggest things that consulting is about is hitting answers quickly and always thinking about what are you gonna do to make that answer better. So because of that, let's actually look at, specifically this piece and the 5 big steps that we want to talk about. First thing is always ask for a minute to gather your thoughts. It's super, super important to actually like lay this out just because it's formulaic and it'll make your life easier if you can actually just kind of read through something more formulaically. Also, sometimes in cases, the recommendation isn't always like very, very clear from this, right? Looking at this case, there can be like a dozen good recommendations, right? The key is to pick the client problem and to pick a recommendation that will address that problem. Then number 4 here is to actually provide some supporting points to answer that. So restating points that we actually did in the case. And then lastly, really, really important is to conclude with risks and next steps. There's no such thing as like a perfect solution in consulting, right? If there was a perfect solution, then companies wouldn't hire consultants. So it's really important to think about risks and next steps. So we're just gonna quickly breeze through this. Our problem is, as we mentioned at the first part of the case, it's an organic food store company facing declining profits. An answer, which would be a recommendation, would be to partner with influential Instagram accounts. One reason why is because we only need to partner with 4 influencers to reach the revenue target, and like, that's not that many influencers. And 2, because they make $25,000 off of each influencer and pay them $20,000, there is actually a profit, which addresses this key problem. So you see that there's a very clear cohesion between this. One risk is that you're shifting the focus to social media, and so you're going to emphasize young consumers more so than older customers. And for an organic food store, even though our generation is probably like inclined towards organic foods, we also don't have necessarily the same money to pay the high-end premium prices that adults might do. So a logical next step would be to find ways to reach adult consumers. So again, like, this is very formulaic, and honestly, like, whenever you present it, it shouldn't take more than a minute. That's usually like a good rule of thumb. And again, like, literally it's just reading this down, which is why taking a minute to gather your thoughts is really, really important. So with that, that wraps up this guided practice. And so Leo and I are going to quickly go through some of the best practices that we've kind of found throughout this. So Leo, you want to take it away?
Sure. So we have a set of 10 best practices. Here are the first 5. We used to hand these out in like a nice piece of laminated paper, like a note card kind of thing.
I'm holding it.
Oh, wow.
I have like 100 of these printed out, but unfortunately, COVID doesn't want you to have them.
Damn, but you have this virtually now. So let's go through these. First is to take a minute and gather your thoughts, right? Especially after the first question, in the first question when you're coming up with the approach. A structured response is easier for us to follow, and it helps you organize the great ideas you have. So don't be afraid to ask for a minute. Don't be afraid to ask for a little bit of time for the brainstorm. Don't be afraid to ask for a little bit of minute to go through the math problems, because a structured response is better than no structure. Second is to make assumptions and round numbers. You don't need to be a human calculator or encyclopedia to be a good consultant. So make things easy for yourself. And again, we don't have much time during the case, so we don't want to get bogged down with the 32 times 45. And we'll probably ask you to round that, or you can ask to round that. 3 is to communicate. The interview is a collaborative process. So think out loud and ask questions. We want to see you at your best. It is a collaborative process in the sense that we are trying to help you get through the entire case. We're not there to stump you. We're not there to test and stop you in your progress. So if we know what you're thinking, if the interviewers know what you're thinking, then it's easier for them to step in and nudge you in the right direction if they feel that you are going slightly off course. Fourth is to keep calm and carry on. There is no right answer or process, so don't get flustered if you make a mistake. Power through the obstacles. I'm sure a lot of venture members can tell you about times in their individual interview where they thought they made a little bit of a mistake, but they bounced back and they were able to pass the individual interview. And lastly is to have fun. Enjoy the problem solving that consultants do every day. This is a mini version of the type of experience you'll get as a consultant in venture. Oftentimes we might say, oh, the client wants us to estimate, this number, and you can't find that number on Google. Then you kind of have to build out a market sizing, like a breakdown, and size the market. Samir, you want to take the next 5?
Yep, let's do it. So in addition to those 5 things, and truly whenever we say master those first, we do mean it. But these are some other things that you can do that will really help you stand out. And this is where you can sort of push from, that B+ case to the A+ case. So the first thing is to have a clear and structured approach. One of the themes you probably noticed throughout all of this is putting things in little tables and columns, McKinsey frameworks. Really having clear and structured approach makes everyone's life easier. It makes your life easier because you actually have structure to your thoughts, and it makes our life easier because we actually have a better idea of what you're thinking and what you're doing. Next is using pen and paper to show your thinking. Visualizing stuff is super, super useful because one, a lot of consulting is actually presenting stuff. And so being able to actually take those words and all of your thought processes and put it into something visual will make your life and our lives much better. 3 is a really, really important one. Be creative and show us how you solve a problem. And notice we italicize you. Bring in your expertise and your flavor to the case. All of you have cool life experiences, unique perspectives, definitely utilize them, right? If you have interesting backgrounds, if you're a grocery shopper and you're an expert on grocery stores, bring that to the case whenever you have a grocery store case, right? In general, we really want to see how you solve a problem uniquely. Next is showcasing your strengths, and this is a really big one. Don't try to avoid mistakes, because in general, when you try to avoid mistakes, you make mistakes, and then you get mad at yourself because you were trying to avoid them in the first place, and then things kind of go awry. Instead, frame it the other way. Show what you can offer. Show what your strengths are. So I can give an example. So my strength is mental math. So in every single case I did for industry, I would basically intentionally not write down certain math things and just do it in my head because I knew that was a strength of mine. Of course, I got that wrong one time, but don't worry about that. In general, do your best to showcase your strengths and showcase your backgrounds. And then the 5th one is also extremely important. Whenever we kept talking about assess and contextualize, it really means interpreting information with the objective in mind. And that's really important. Ask yourself, what does it mean? Ask yourself how it's relevant to the case. If you can do this consistently and get into the habit of doing that, it really will make your cases to the next level and take it to the next level. So with that, we're going to do really flip this to your side and actually do an interactive case. Here's also just a quick slide to talk about how you can prep. We highly recommend McKinsey, Bain, BCG's interactive case libraries. They're really, really helpful. There are good cases on there. There's a website called Rocket Blocks. Definitely buy. Don't pay for it. It's really expensive, but they have a week-long free trial, which is more than enough time to practice for our interview. And then also case with your friends. Always good to have case buddies. Leo and I were case buddies whenever we were going through consulting recruiting, so that was a great time. So again, just to quickly restate our case interview essentials: structured analysis, super important; communication, important; professionalism and having your stuff together is really important; being creative and having fun; having a good attitude and being teachable, right? All of these things really come to the fore, and they'll make a big difference whenever you're actually in the case.